What up, folks? Dr. D here with another video. Today we're going to talk about Ableton Live and Midi sequencing editing. Alright, let's get to it. Basically, Midi is musical instrument digital interface. It's kind of a language that goes from your Midi keyboard and puts that signal into the computer. And you can pretty much trigger any sound in the world. Usually what happens when I start out, I'll be working within session view, which is this first view with all the different faders. And I've went ahead and recorded a keyboard part. You'll see the MIDI notes down here, and if you don't see the MIDI notes, you'll see the device view. So essentially, down in this bottom window pane of Ableton, this can either be your editing view or your device view. It's going to be Shift-Tab to go back and forth between these two views. In the editor view, I see all the MIDI notes, and I can zoom in by placing my cursor at the top of the ruler here where you see these numbers, and I can click and drag up and down or left and right or whatever to change my view. Another thing is on the left side of the MIDI editor where you see the notes, the keyboard kind of layout here. I can do the same thing. If I click and hold and drag, I can kind of change my view and zoom in and out so I'm looking at my notes in the kind of full window spectrum here. Trimming notes, once they're recorded, your cursor will turn into a little bracket tool at the beginning or the end of each of these notes. This is the trim tool, and you can extend the length of the note or change where it starts pretty easily by just clicking and dragging across that. Another thing you can do is click on the single note and move it to different locations. So for instance, I make a mistake on one of these notes, I can easily kind of get in here and edit that and correct that. Another thing you can do, select multiple notes. So if I drag and select several different notes, I can first of all move them as a group. So I could take like a whole entire chord or a whole entire chord progression or something like that, a melody, and I can select it and I can move it and transpose it to a different place. I can also trim like that in that global manner of trimming the edges or groups of these notes like that as well. Similarly, I can copy and paste in the same manner. So for instance, say I didn't have all this keyboard stuff on the back end. I could select the first 8 bars of MIDI notes. Let me turn off that sound there. What I'm trying to do here is to select 4 bars of MIDI notes, copy them to the last 4 bars of my 8-bar phrase. So I've done that, selected all those notes, and in Ableton, Command D is duplicate. So that'll put those notes at the end of that selection. But check this out. If you look really close here, my note started on the downbeat of 1 in this first phrase. Now, on the downbeat of measure 5, this should be the starting point. But what happened was now my note starts a little bit earlier than the downbeat of that measure. So let me just back up and show you what happened. When I made that selection here, I did not select all the way across to the end of bar 4. You kind of see this little blue line here. That's kind of a tricky thing. So you have to select all the way from that edge and double check this little blue line here to make sure that it's totally kind of covering the 4 bars. Now when I use Command D, I can duplicate that and then it'll start right there on the downbeat of 5 and everything's going to be good. So copying, pasting is a quick way of taking like 1 bar, 2 bars, or 4 bars of a figure that you've played and maybe cleaned up, and then copy it over to another section. The bottom of each of these notes, so these little things down here are called velocity stems, and I can change essentially the dynamics of my notes and edit the dynamics of my notes by moving these around, kind of like control the dynamics. A lot of times what I'll do is select all of the MIDI blocks. That's kind of a common thing. So Command A on a Mac or Control A on a PC is going to be to select all. So I put my cursor down here inside that MIDI editor window, Command A, selects all of the MIDI notes. And from there I can select all of the MIDI velocity stems at once. Move them all the way up, press them to the top, the ceiling of that MIDI region, and then I can bring them back down and they all are the same velocity. So that's one way of leveling out all of your MIDI notes. One of the things about velocity stems, if I have it smashed to the top at the loudest dynamic, it really has a distorted kind of crunchy sound to it. But if I bring it down, it's a little bit softer. So tonally, it changes depending on where my velocity stems are. Let's talk about the pencil tool. So in Ableton, if you hit the B, just the letter B, this pencil shows up. And this is a tool at which you can use to draw in MIDI notes. So that brings me to another thing I want to talk about, very important here, how to set up your grid. So a grid is essentially the subdivisions of the beats or bars that you're working with. Currently, it looks like I have 3, this is a whole measure. Each of these numbers is a measure. So I have beat 1, 2, 3, 4, and then the next measure here, measure 4. So these are going to be eighth notes, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and, okay? So these little lines here are the eighth note subdivisions. When I draw with my pencil tool or I do any kind of quantizing, it's going to snap those into that grid. So what I can do is I can change the grid. I can turn it off. I can turn it on with Command 4. So essentially Command, the Command key, or maybe the Control key on a PC. This is Mac I'm working on, so Command. 1, 2, 3, and 4 in combination with Command are going to change your subdivision of your grid. So for instance, Command 4, these grid lines get grayed out a little bit, and what you'll notice is I can move my MIDI notes basically freely. They slip back and forth. They don't snap into the grid. Command 1 will add subdivisions. Okay, so Command 1, you see I'm adding subdivisions. I can go from like quarter notes to eighth notes to 16th notes. Command 2 lessens the subdivisions. So I can go from like, those are whole measures right there. And then I add 16ths and 8ths and 32nd notes and all that kind of stuff like that. Command 3 will change to a triplet subdivision. Okay, so for instance, dun 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 dun. So things in 2s and 4s, or things in 3s and 6s and 12s and all that kind of good stuff. The next thing I want to show you is quantizing. So when you perform something into MIDI and track it and record it, you will probably be less than perfect. And you can see that here with my performance of this piano riff that I just played a minute ago. If you zoom in here, you can see that, hey, that note is a little too long, that note was a little bit early, that note was a little bit late, boom, boom, boom. Basically all through this entire phrase, I was a little off. When I want to make things perfect, I'm going to use what's called quantizing, which is essentially snapping all of these notes into the grid line so that they're perfect. So the trick with doing this is you have to have the grid set up. Some of my notes occur on the eighth note subdivision. So essentially I have to select the notes first that I'm going to quantize. All right, and then when I use Command U or Control U on a PC, it's going to snap those to the closest grid line. So check this out. These are all pretty close to the line, but this one's in the middle. When I use Command U, it's going to stretch those out to fill the entire grid line to the closest end of the grid line, and it's going to move it to the closest beginning of the grid line. But this has totally changed the rhythm of my notes. What I should have done is added another grid line so that I have a eighth note subdivision. So Command 1 will give me another subdivision of my grid. And now that you can see I have these eighth notes, when I use Command U, it's going to snap those into the grid a little bit more accurate. This allows me, this little window here allows me to set the way that the grid quantization works. I can quantize to a certain grid. I can have it quantize and adjust the note from the start or the end, or just one or the other. You know, for instance, if I don't want it to change the end of the note, let me just back that up to where I was doing earlier. If I selected these notes and I quantized them and I didn't have the end quantized point set, it's not going to stretch my notes out. Okay, cool. All right, so there I go. I've got a things sounding the way I want them to sound. Hopefully you learned some stuff. Be sure to subscribe and check out the other videos we got. We're dropping videos every single day, or I am. And yeah, it's all about the music here. Keep producing, keep writing, and being creative, and we'll see you in the interwebs somewhere else. Peace out.